Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary and Madam Secretary, for being here. I want to apologize in advance. I've got a couple of other committees going, so I'm going to be in and out. I'd like to hear you talk today about a couple of things. First, Madam Secretary, I'm very disappointed in the administration's decision to place a moratorium on LNG permits. I don't see how that is going to further the goal of climate change. I do see how that is going to hurt America's energy independence, but equally important, it's going to hurt our friends in Europe. It's going to help our enemies, like Qatar. It looks political to me, and I'm hoping you'll be able to address that. I'd also like to talk today about whether the administration would consider, so far it hasn't, it's considered it, but it hasn't done it, advancing petroleum pit production. We've done better, but it's still not enough. I'm disappointed that the administration hasn't emphasized nuclear energy funding. I don't understand how we're going to achieve carbon neutrality without advanced small modular nuclear reactors. And the administration doesn't seem to want to talk too much about the benefits. Of course, there are costs as well, but the benefits of nuclear energy. It seems to have worked out well in countries like France, which sees its energy future, including a big role for nuclear energy. So those are the kinds of things that I'm hoping we can talk about today. But I want to end my remarks, Secretary Granholm, with a more general thought. I consider you to be one of the most intelligent and accomplished appointees by President Biden. That doesn't mean I agree with all of the positions that you have taken. I don't know to what extent you have taken those positions because you believe them or because you have been directed to take them by the White House. But I also feel like in our debate over energy transition, we're missing a major piece of the puzzle. And that's an explanation to the American people about what we're doing, why we're doing it, the costs of doing it, and the benefits, and the trade-offs. And I think you and your department should take on that responsibility. Let me try to be more specific. There's a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bjorn Lomborg. I'm not saying that he has all the answers, but he is a visiting professor at Stanford. He's head of a think tank in Europe called the Copenhagen Consensus. He is basically a climate change economist. And in peer-reviewed studies, he predicts, for example, that in order for us to be carbon neutral, and not just the United States and the world, by 2050, and to maintain it through 2100, it will cost about 1% of the world's, not America's, but the world's GDP. Well, that doesn't sound like much until you reduce it to raw dollars. That's $27 trillion a year. That's the cost. He raises the question of whether we should spend that $27 trillion or take a portion of it and instead use it to combat the effects of climate change, which he estimates we could do successfully worldwide for $1 trillion a year. Now, you may not agree with his numbers or his analysis, but a cost-benefit analysis is worth pursuing instead of just throwing a bunch of money at the problem. For example, he raises the question, he believes that in order for China to become carbon neutral by 2050 and maintain its carbon neutrality through 2100, it will cost China $1 trillion a year. China's not spending $1 trillion a year. China, in fact, has increased its carbon emissions 300% by 1990. He raises the question, it's a fair question, what happens if China doesn't cooperate? What's the impact on world carbon neutrality? If it doesn't cooperate, is America wasting all its money? He raises the question about Russia. He thinks that Russia needs to start spending today $400 to $500 billion a year and spend that amount every year between now and 2100 to achieve carbon neutrality. It's about 3 times what Russia spends on its military. Does anyone in this room honestly believe that President Putin tomorrow is going to stand up and say, well, I'm going to stop spending money on my military and start spending it on CO2 emissions? And Professor Lumberg raises the question of, well, what happens if they don't? What happens if India doesn't cooperate? Developing countries, they want the same things as us. They want to be able to eat and live indoors, and their children to have better lives. Are we going to have to pay developing countries for their energy transition, particularly when it's cheaper for them to advance their societies using fossil fuels? These are the kind of questions that need to be hit head on, and we're not doing it. And this administration, with all due respect, has not done it. All we're doing is throwing money at a problem. And I asked, I think it was your deputy secretary, Madam Secretary, about a year or so ago, I said, if the United States government achieves carbon neutrality by 2050, and we spend the money to do it, how much will that lower world temperatures? Or how much will that decrease the increase in world temperatures? He said, I can't guarantee you that it'll lower temperatures at all, because it depends on other countries. And I think that needs to be addressed head on, and I think you're the person to do it. I don't know if the White House will let you, but the world is yearning for this. I'm going on too long. I'm sorry, Madam Chair, but people are starting to figure out that they're going to have to pay for this. We see it in Germany right now. I mean, Germany said, well, we're just going to require everybody to convert to heat pumps. Now, all of a sudden, people say, well, you mean I've got to go buy a $15,000 heat pump? And so they're pushing back. And in order to have people buy into an energy transition, they've got to understand that there's an overarching plan. Secretary Granholm, do you believe that the world can achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 without nuclear energy playing a substantial role?
I do not.
Okay. I agree with you. I want to go back to my thesis that I hope I articulated it reasonably well. But we don't have an overarching plan or analysis for achieving CO2. In my opinion, we're just throwing money at it. Let's suppose Professor Lundberg is right, 27 trillion a year. That's worldwide to achieve carbon neutrality and maintain it through 2100. Let's assume America's share, we produce 15% of CO2 emissions. That makes our share about $4 trillion a year. That's, I don't know, 8 to 10% of our GDP. Doesn't sound like much when you talk about it that way, but it's still $4 trillion a year, every year. That's money we can't spend on health care or feeding people, housing. What happens if we start spending $4 trillion a year each year for every year through just 2050? And China doesn't do its part, or Russia doesn't do its part, or India doesn't do its part, or Vietnam or Thailand. How much is our money going to reduce world temperatures, or the increase in world temperatures? The answer is zero, isn't it?
No, I don't think it's zero, but I do know that this is why we have global
But how much is it?
This is why we have all 190 countries signed on to get to net zero by 2050.
I know they've signed on, and excuse me for
and
interrupting.
countries are moving in that direction, sir.
But they're not doing, I'm asking you, and I hope they do it, okay? If it turns out that the scientists are right. I'm not saying they are or they aren't. It's just that the whole topic has become so politicized. But we never talk about what happens if they don't and what is the likelihood that they will. And let me ask you again, if we spend $4 trillion a year, every year, until 2050 to achieve carbon neutrality in the United States, and President Putin and President Xi and Prime Minister Modi say, I don't think so. I think I'm going to spend that on domestic needs in my countries. How much are we going to reduce world temperatures?
With respect, I'm not going to buy into the hypothetical because they have said, I don't know about Putin, but the president of China and Prime Minister Modi have all made commitments to move in this direction and are spending money to move in this direction. But the better question is, or a parallel question would be, what happens if we don't?
Well, I'm interested in my question, though. You're good, but I don't want you to change the subject. Have you ever known President Xi to lie?
Well, I am telling you what is in
lies on
the
occasion,
plan
doesn't he?
and what we have seen in terms of their spending. They have spent about $400 billion a year so far. That was, I think, in 2023 on renewable energy. So
what about Russia?
Spending.
What about Russia?
Spending. Russia,
you honestly believe that
I don't have the information on Russia. They're not very transparent. But all of these countries have signed on to the goal. And my point is, if we don't, sir, if we don't, we will be spending globally $38 trillion a year to clean up after the extreme weather events that are happening because of climate change.
But you use that figure, but I've seen no basis for it. Professor,
I can send you that.
Professor Lundberg says it's much less than that. But here's my point. Do we just start spending the $4 trillion a year and spend it blindly every year like clockwork? Or at what point, if China's not pulling its load, or Russia, or Vietnam, or Sub-Saharan Africa, at what point do we say, what model do we have in place to say, whoa, wait a minute, we're wasting our money because they're not spending theirs?
I believe that the United States and its leadership in this world, as well as our allies, are not going to throw in the towel. That this is too important in terms of our world, in terms of climate change going into the future and the devastating impact it is having right now, much less in 2050.
I'm out of time, but do you trust, look me in the eye, do you trust Vladimir Putin?
No, I don't trust him.
Or President Xi Jinping to do anything other than what is in their best political interest and the power that they achieve in the world? Do you really believe that?
And in China's interest, it is in their interest to move down this path because they are experiencing extreme heat waves and death as a result of climate change. And this is why they're spending what they are. And this is why they want to dominate these clean energy technologies, because they see an economic advantage for them to be leading in this. So, no, I don't trust what they say, but we will verify.
But you're willing, well, I've gone over. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I'll try to come back or
Thank
not.
you.